we'd like now to move on to the next session, and which is hosted by DPAM. And this session is going to focus on systemic human rights assessments, pitfalls and opportunities. And for that, we have with us today Matthew Welch, Responsible Investment Specialist at DPAM.
Hello, good afternoon. Let's see if it works here. Yes, that's me. Great. So good afternoon. I'm Matthew Welch, Responsible Investment Specialist at DPAM. And today we'll venture into the world of social risks. Okay? So we'll try to answer, actually, why should we care about social risks? What do these risks entail? What frameworks can we use to actually assess these risks? And how to do it in practice? Because we've been actually applying this, or it has been a whole journey that we actually took to try to enumerate these risks. And I think it's important to share best practices and see how we can actually learn from each other. So the first slide is really trying to see why should we care about social risks. Now, the first, on the top left, you can see a result of a survey by Luxembourg for Finance, asking asset managers, okay, well, what organizational risks can be mitigated through addressing human rights? And we saw that 85% of asset managers actually mention reputational risks. Next one, we've got risk infringement, and a third is a regulatory risk. Now, I think that very soon, like we see later, the regulatory risk to actually take into consideration human rights will go up. But so the first one is reputational risk. You don't want to be actually faced with a company that really infringes risk in your portfolio. An example of this is, you can see on the top right, the evolution of a stock price of a company that faced some controversies around sourcing and human rights. You can see that between 2020 and 2021, it had 2 steep drops because of controversy. And what happened afterwards, well, I don't think that anybody wants to have a company like that in their portfolios. And by just doing a systemic social risk assessment, you can actually avoid investing in a company like this. Then in the bottom left, you've got a trust barometer survey. It's a survey again, but a little bit more broad, where you ask actually, it's a survey taking across countries, so it's not regional specialties, but across countries, what you expect from companies, where here again, you've got the majority of responding say, I expect my company to have a societal role to play. And fourth, that's the bottom right, well, just get to know your investee companies. If you know the risk that your company is faced with, you can make better investment decisions, and you can make smarter investment decisions. So I think that with looking at social risks, taking these into consideration, for all different stakeholders, for your clients, for your PM, for probably your risk department, all will be happy that you do this. Now, we understand that social risks are important, but what do we mean by social risk? Well, for fun, what I did is I took all the social indicators from Sustainalytics, a data provider, just to see what Sustainalytics is actually thinking about social risks. And now if we look at the social risks they defined, they talked about diversity programs. They're talking about employee training. They're talking about cybersecurity. They're talking about nutrition and health programs. They're talking about asset quality. So we can see that if we discuss something social, it goes in all different directions. Now, the one common denominator of all this is human rights. It always has been human rights. Now, what are human rights? Very basic, every person should be treated with dignity. It's not rocket science, right? Now, all of these elements that I just mentioned are ingrained and starting from human rights. Something that's very important is that we can see that human rights compared to, for example, we talked a lot about climate before. On climate, you've got the big star at the end of the tunnel, the 1.5 degrees that everybody wants to work towards. On human rights, you don't have that star. Well, you have them, but there are many stars, actually, because there is not one universal, well, there is a universal declaration for human rights, but you've got a lot of different bilateral negotiations and treaties, as well as customary law that actually defends these human rights. So it's a little bit more challenging to try to find where you have to work on. Now, the UN Office for Human Rights has defined one thing, and that's for human rights. And you talk about human rights and businesses, it depends on the sector and the operational focus. So by looking at the sector and looking at the operational focus, by having in mind every person should be treated with dignity, it's quite easy to deduct which human rights are relevant for a certain company. Now, we know social is important. We know that human rights is the basis. Now, how do you assess these? Luckily for us, there have been some frameworks, international frameworks, that actually have been working on human rights for many years. Now, I see that this slide has been a little bit butchered, but I think with my help, we'll get through it. We start at the right. So one of the two frameworks is the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. It's been created more than 10 years ago, and it's a set of responsibilities for both businesses and countries on where the responsibility lies on human rights. I will not go through all the UN Guiding Principles, but it's important to understand that a company has actually three expectations. They should have a policy commitment, they should track that commitment, and they should report on that commitment. Again, it's not rocket science. Now, of course, this is what you expect from a company. I will not go through the other UN Guiding Principles expectations, but this is what you have to expect from a company. Another framework that is very often used is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprise on responsible business conduct. And that's the thing you can see on your left. And I think if you follow that circle, you can actually arrive to very tangible actions that you can expect from a company. So let's go through it. We start at 1. Embed responsible business conduct in your policies. So you have a policy on human rights, but most important, in your management systems. We do not expect from companies to have a person responsible for human rights that have its own office and that just working on its own. We want to have these policies translated across the company, going from HR to procurement to investments. Second is to identify and assess adverse impacts. What does that mean? Well, you should know where your company has an impact on and how far that impact is reaching. Once you understand that impact, you tell to your companies, well, okay, then just cease, prevent, or mitigate the negative impact that you might have. Fourth is tracking. You're trying to alleviate something, you track how it goes. Fifth is communicate or report on it, which is a very important one, especially for asset managers. And sixth is provide cooperation for remediation. So basically what you have to do is every company you invested in should follow these OECD guidelines. And this is not a text-the-box exercise. I know that before we were putting some bad lights on the classic ESG rating agencies. I can only concur with the previous speaker, because very often they consider it as a tick-the-box exercise, which is not. Okay? You really have to look at the policies, read the policies, and the processes. Now, when you present this to a colleague, very often they will be like, okay, yeah, that's very nice, I like it, but we're not asking too much. I mean, okay, the OECD guidelines are important, but do we really have to go that far? And that's when I show this slide. Now, don't start crying, it's a regulatory slide, but again, we'll get through it together. Basically, if you're challenged on asking whether or not you have to go through the OECD guidelines, the answer is yes. Why? Because of 4 main pillars around regulation. First, you've got the investor ESG regulation. Before, we already heard the taxonomy, and the previous speaker clearly mentioned that in the taxonomy, in the green taxonomy, you've got the MSS, or the minimum social safeguards. Something can be green, but of course, it also still has to answer to minimum safeguards around human rights. So actually, in the current regulation already, we can see that it's the role of an asset manager to follow these. We have the SDR regulation in the UK and also in the US coming up, and here again, they're also focusing on those safeguards, the social safeguards that need to be there. So again, if once a PM comes to you, fund manager comes to you, do we really have to ask all this to our investee companies? Well, yes, clearly, because it's the law. Now, second is a due diligence legislator, because, okay, we have a role as an asset manager, but investee companies also will be subject to new laws around due diligence. Now, what is due diligence? Due diligence is really trying to map your whole value chain or supply chain, seeing which people you affect, both positive and negative, and where you affect them negatively, trying to mitigate that negative impact. In Europe, we've got the CSDDD, or the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that will come into place in 2025-26, that will actually force European companies to have these due diligence practices. So again, if you can actually anticipate on these changes, we're better off. Same guidelines are taking place in Japan. And in Europe, again, before we heard Europe is taking the lead, I can only concur with this, because you also have, for example, the EU deforestation regulation that will also focus on a due diligence. So European companies will have to have that due diligence mapping in place, and it will also reach companies outside of Europe. Because if a non-European company wants to do business in Europe, they will also have to satisfy some of these regulations. So we need to, because the regulator asks us. You also have taxonomies. We talked about the green taxonomy. Well, actually, there was also a social taxonomy. The Commission started to draft this, and once they saw that social was way more complex than climate, joking, but they decided, okay, well, let's stop with this and let's put it for the next Commission. But actually, there is already a draft taxonomy on social elements in place right now. Well, it's drafted, but it still has to be negotiated, etc. Also, in other countries, you have these social taxonomies popping up. And then you've got ESG disclosure standards, and there we talk about companies in Europe, but also, again, outside of Europe that have business in Europe will need to report on the impact that they have with their activities. So, are we asking too much to companies? I don't think so, because eventually they will have to follow the rules anyway. Now, I told you the OECD guidelines, they are quite broad. And I know it's challenging because you need to actually check a lot of documents and engage with the companies to understand what they're actually doing. And of course, you don't have that capacity to do that. I mean, unless you're a very, 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 very big asset managers, you cannot check every position that you have in portfolio to check whether a company is compliant with the OECD guidelines. So again, I'm totally aligned with the previous speaker, get help. Get help, not from the traditional ESG agencies like the MSCIs and Sustainalytics, because what they do is just tick a box, but actually get help from people that know something about this. You have plenty NGOs out there that are ranking companies based on their salient human rights issues. What are salient human rights issues? Remember, I told you before, human rights are dependent on the sector and the operations of a company. And there are many, many NGOs that actually look at these salient risks and are going to rank companies on these risks. You've got, for example, the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is one of my favorites. What they do is they map 2,000 companies worldwide that can be active on SDGs, and they're going to rank them on how well they actually apply these respect of human rights. You've got the spot ranking, looking at how companies active in the palm oil value chain are respecting human rights. You've got the Fashion Transparency Index, how transparent are fashion brands in their supply chain, because transparency of supply chain is the first prerequisite to have a proper due diligence. You've got Know the Chain, again. You've got Behind the Bars, the code bar, where we're going to rank food companies on how they respect human rights. You've got the Ranking Digital Rights, where you'll see how IT companies are respecting digital and therefore human rights. So one key element to keep here is that you're not alone there. Everybody will have to assess these companies under OECD guidelines, and don't only rely on the classic data providers because it won't bring you further. Use alternative sources that are out there and support them. Now, okay, let's say that we use these external providers and we can see that we're invested in a company that is not performing well on its human rights. What to do now? Luckily, the PRI, so the Principles for Responsible Investments, have translated the OECD guidelines for a certain asset manager. And in that translation, they clearly say, look, it's up to you to prevent or enable a remedy, which very often is difficult, because what your goal is there is actually to engage with a company, have a conversation with a company to try to explain them what you expect from them. Look, you infringe human rights in this way, we want you to provide a certain remedy or stop this activity. In case it doesn't work, your role is to try to increase your leverage. And with that, again, you're not together with this. There are plenty of collaborative engagement initiatives where investors come together around a certain topic, be it digital rights, be it human rights, due diligence, be it being active in conflict areas, to actually group together and try to group resources to talk with one voice to a company and try to explain, look, this is actually what we expect as investors. And then it's up to the asset managers to decide, okay, look, I think that the risks are still too high, so I'm going to divest from a company, or I'm going to keep on nailing on the same nail until the company listens. And you can hitting on the same nail by trying to gather more and more investors around your collaborative engagements to try to change it. You can try to hammer the nail by voting in a certain way during AGMs. You can hammer the nail by actually proposing certain elements to present during the AGM. But there are, again, many tools out there that you can use to try to change the companies in case there is an infringement of human rights. And this brings us to our approach. I will be very brief because I also want to have some questions if there are later. But we try to, at DPAM, implement all these different steps that I just explained to you in our systemic human rights assessment. What you can see on the top is our classic ESG integration. So before anything, you have your classic norm-based screening on global compact principles. You've got your exclusions that you do based on your activities. You've got the exclusions that you do based on your controversies, and you carry out the best in class. But even then, there still might be a risk. So what we did there is we identified 5 high-risk sectors based on different standards, but we've got 5 high-risk sectors where we think, look, human rights here tend to be infringed more often. Second, we're getting help. We're getting help to actually, we're not able to check all the companies in those industries, so we're using some kind of flagging operation to see if a company should be checked further. How do we do this? Well, if a company has a controversy higher than 2 on the level of 2, on 5, sorry. So if the controversy is higher than 2, we will check the company on how it performs on human rights. If it scores in the bottom 20% of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is one of the NGOs I told you before, if we see that the ranking is on the bottom 20, we will check the company further. And we use a specific industry ranking. I told you about some rankings that we saw before, like the spot ranking or the ranking digital rights. If we have a company in the bottom of these rankings, we will again have a flag ringing, we might have a problem here. Now, based on this ranking or these flagging, we have quite some companies to analyze, to be honest. And so what we do is to do a deep dive analysis on a scorecard. So we will use the OECD guidelines that we saw before, these steps with the arrows, and we'll actually check if the company applies these different steps. And if it answers properly on the salient human rights issues it's exposed to. And then based on these scorecards, we can actually think, okay, look, we're actually confident the company is properly doing its human rights assessment. It's okay. Or we can say, look, we don't agree with this, so we will try to engage with the company, increase leverage with other investors, and try to change the company from a standpoint from an investor, so through engagement or voting. And of course, the last resort is divest from the company and communicate about this. So this is what we do and how we try to apply OECD guidelines. And that's how we believe that you should be able to apply those focus on human rights and social issues. Now, to end, 4 lessons learned. Use external providers with a deep knowledge. So I'm not talking about Sustainalytics, MSCIs, whatever. I'm talking about real knowledge about the industry. Focus on salient human rights issues of high-risk industries. No use to check everything at once, trying to take a risk-based approach. Talk to affected stakeholders, which is very key. If you want to know what the expectations should be from a textile company, the best way to know this is to talk to someone that has to work for a textile company. I know sometimes it's challenging to talk to those affected stakeholders, but then at least try to talk to organizations that represent the voice of those stakeholders. And 4th is collaborate. Collaborate with NGOs. I'm not saying that you have to take the word of NGOs for granted, but at least collaborate with them. Use them as a ways to see if there might be a problem somewhere in a company. And also collaborate with investors. Collaborate with other investors that are working on the similar topics. So also a warm welcome if you already work on this, do reach out to me because I would be very happy to understand what you're doing. So these are my 4 takeaways for actually applying a systemic social risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for sharing your DPAM approach on human rights. Does anyone have a question? A question?
Hello, Sylvain Barrette de Lannon. I was curious to know whether by using some of these agencies, you were in a position to avoid a company, well, you decided to avoid a company that resulted into a good decision at the end because of some adverse consequences that some of those agencies have flagged and resulted into your decision to...
Yeah, we did. So again, our approach is looking at our exposure to see if a decision that we've made should be remedied, or we have to engage with a company we invested in. And so when we looked at, for example, the textile sector, we started the engagement with certain companies where we thought, okay, look, these standards are not up to par with the industry standards that we should expect first. But we also decided to divest from certain companies. I won't name names, but from certain textile companies where we thought, okay, look, after an engagement with the company, we realized that the company was not taking it seriously enough. And therefore, we didn't want to have neither reputational risk nor the risk that the company would be, well, damaged by the market because of its lack of policies.
I'm a bit surprised that you don't want to communicate about the company because you just said we communicate.
Okay, it was Li-Ning, a Chinese textile company.
Thank you. Another question? No? Okay, thank you, Mathieu, again, and to DPAM for hosting the session. So